Good morning. Good morning. We are here with Brother Ish, Teacher Ish X on Twitter. Look, our team, Chris Stewart, the leader of this platform, the creator of Freedom Friday. He is not with us this week. He'll be back soon. But we definitely have a ton to talk about today. Obviously, for those who are even somewhat aware, know that the Supreme Court, led by Uncle Ruckus himself, in many ways, is up there and shared a new level of how to dismantle progress, reverse the hands of time, go backwards. And we already know that their mindset was already backwards. So now they're just trying to make sure that they craft the laws, the policies, etc. So we'll get into that. And we originally were going to talk about anti-July 4th and what does that really mean for the Black people of this country. And Supreme Court helped us out because they gave us additional evidence of why this is all madness. So welcome, Ish. Good morning. Welcome to everyone who's out there on Freedom Friday. And as Chris always says, we are definitely not free. Dr. Fuller used to say, we used to have a quote from someone. I don't remember who he used to attribute it to. He said, yeah, after the emancipation, we were liberated, but not yet free. And guess what? We're still, in some ways, maybe less liberated and certainly not yet free. Good morning, Ish.
Good morning, brother. How you doing?
Good. Doing well. Welcome back. Thanks for bringing the content. The expertise. You're leading history department. All of this is just so relevant. I think you're in a really fantastic place in your, not just only your career, but just in your civic leadership, to really be able to, not just within schools, but within the district, within the city, and really, nationally. So I'd love for you to, set the ground about, before we even get into the Supreme Court, July 4th. We'd love for you to talk about Professor Dr. Legarrette and the work that's happening at the University of Buffalo. There's a conference coming up. And so we'd love to start there because everywhere's a classroom. People need to be aware. People need to know that while these policies are happening, what did we do in the past? We had teach-ins. We had conversations. We had organizing. We had political education. PE, before it stood for physical education, I understood it to mean political education, right? And so when I would hear PE, then when I got to become a teacher, they were like, PE? I'm like, oh, dope, we having PE. And they were talking about gym class. So I was like, oh, that's not quite the same that I was accustomed to growing up, but would love to start there. Where can people get information? Let's start with Buffalo, but where are the places and spaces that people should be plugging into, signing up, becoming members, subscribing to newsletters, all that kind of stuff. Let's start there from the classroom, where you become aware. How do you unplug from the matrix, plug into PE, and then we'll start going into some of the hot topics of racism, hot trash racism that's out there these days.
Well, first thing I need to say and point out, and I'm glad that you're even framing it in this way, educators really gain a much more semblance of feeling a part of a larger cause, right? When they're networking, when they're involved in these type of organizations, where not only are you doing work and practicing your own type of craft in the classroom, but you're taking those skills that you've learned of talking to diverse audiences about complex ideas, and you're taking that into the real world to organize around real issues that affect the children in your classroom and the communities that you serve. To me, I don't really necessarily see where that line is, right? That is a blurred line between our professional lives and our personal lives and what we put it front and center. And, there has been research out there that shows that especially teachers who might feel isolated in school buildings, who get involved with teacher networks, involved in causes and interests that they find important, tend to be able to be retained longer, feel more valued, and feel really, much more involved and engaged in the work that they're doing within the classroom with the students, right? And unfortunately, we all know due to the pandemic, right, a lot of that work cultivating such organizations and networks, especially around teacher, educators and everything, kind of fell to the wayside during the pandemic. And only right now you're starting to see the bubbling up again of folks talking about the importance of organizing in these type of spaces, right? Where not only are educators and teachers involved, but you also want to invite parents, potentially students when possible, and also the larger community, right? Because we're talking about not only across racial conversation, we're talking about across class, we're talking about across, intergenerational, right? So I think it's just so important that folks get involved in those. Now, with that being said, unfortunately in Philly, we used to have a very robust type of teacher network, organizations like Teacher Action Group, TAG, Philadelphia Black History Collaborative. That's to shout out my brother and the work that we did. And a lot of those organizations, due to people's own personal capacity, have kind of, got limited in the scope of how much work is actually being done in those spaes right now. And it would need reinvigorated, energy. So like groups like the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, RJOC, if you go online, you can look them up. Organizations like the National Black Lives Matter at School, which started in Philadelphia, which is now national. They're having a combination of like study schools and other type of things that folks can get plugged into at blacklivesmatteratschool.com. There's also organizations like the Melanated Educators Collective, MEC. You can also search them up online and join them. And these are just the initial steps of trying to get plugged in about some of the work that's going on and starting to really bubble up again. Now, to transition, Brother LeGarrette King, first, I just want to say that I first met this brother. He contacted us, some professor from the University of Missouri, right? And he was looking into the work that we're doing when we first started the Philadelphia Black History Collaborative. Shout out to my brother Yasin. And when he said, I want to really support your work, I'm trying to do similar work with the university right now, how can I support? And this brother, just from jump, just willing to like throw money at us if necessary and be really involved. And after our first year, when we had our first conference, PBHC, he had a conference the next year in the university at the University of Missouri, where he was a professor. And then he had several other type of conferences like that, even through the pandemic, when PBHC had to step back from the work that we were doing due to our capacity and other things like that. And he continued doing these conferences. And they usually happen at the end of July. And then due to the backlash with CRT, the University of Missouri became more difficult. So thank the Lord that LeGarrette's now at the University of Buffalo. And last year was his first time where he had an in-person conference again, the Teaching Black History Conference at the University of Buffalo. And this year will be the second time at the University of Buffalo, but I think it's the 6th or 7th one overall that he's had conference-wise. And this year's theme is the 50 years of hip hop. It's different subjects, different presenters on different, things related to hip hop. I'm doing John about contemporary conscious hip hop and Africana studies. Like you're going to get really deep into the weeds of kind of like what's the significance of hip hop culturally, politically, socially, all those type of things, right? The good, bad, ugly, and all in between. So this is happening in July 21st to 23rd at the University of Buffalo. If you just Google Teaching Black History Conference, you'll come right to it. And the information will be on the front page. Not only are you able to attend the conference, but if you have the time and if this is your focus area, there are 2 pre-conference retreats. The first pre-conference retreat that you can attend, which is 2 days, the 19th and the 20th before the conference starts on the 21st, is a writer's retreat around writing around racial literacy. Or you have the option of attending another pre-conference retreat for social studies coordinators about how to integrate Africana studies, Black history into regular curriculum. If you don't have a required course like we're blessed in Philadelphia, or if you're seeking just to think about how can you actually beefing up and make your course much more relevant to the students that are in front of you, right? That's also happening at the pre-conference retreat. But if you go to the webpage, you will see all this information. You'll be able to sign up. They're still taking registrants. I strongly suggest folks to come through, man. It's going to be real. It's going to be real cool.
Yeah, that's what's up. That's what's up. Yeah, and if you can, if you put it in the chat here, then the team can put it, or put it in the regular chat and tweet it out, and make sure that Dr. King is like, listen, all of this, and when we talk about, like, it reminds me, I'm glad you're doing the joint about the hip hop and the power of that, and as we talked about before in the show, I think it's one of the main reasons it was infiltrated and sold out, right? You know what I mean? And in this corporate sense, because of the power that could be involved in it. When you see a PE, when you see the native tongue, and knowing, like, wait a minute, the youth are listening to that. How do we jump ahead of this, get ahead of this, and influence in a different direction? How do we kind of, sometimes you see those old train tracks, and I forget what it's called, but there's a lever that you could do to switch the track, where the train could be, just going on one way, and you switch it and kind of put it on another one. I'm gonna find out the term for that, because that's what happens a lot of times with our art, with our music, with our messaging. There's a behind the scene lever. Someone just like switches it, and if you're not like conscious, like, wait a minute, we were on that lane, now we're on this lane, you end up doing some other stuff, right? And that wasn't where it happened. I think another analogy of travel, we're all like on this road traversing this path of life. If two ships start off, imagine a conscious and an unconscious hip hop artist, and they both leave the community, and they're about to, like, all right, we're going to go out, we're side by side on this boat, two different boats. If one just moves one degree, if they change their angle by 1 degree, where would they be in 50 years from now? Where would they be 50 years from now if they both, and that's what I feel like happens sometimes, so 50 years later, you got one boat, hip hop boat, that's way over here, one hip hop boat that's way over here. And, it just changed by 1 degree. But that's why the vigilance and understanding of history, where we started, what was the original intent, how could it be used, how has it been used, and to uplift, to create, to inspire, to invigorate, to politicize, to radicalize in conscious terms and efforts, and then where does it end up being? So that being said, man, Supreme Court, we both are we're talking a couple minutes before the show began, man, and for those who aren't aware, Supreme Court, offered a decision about affirmative action, particularly in higher ed, but we know that Supreme Court decisions are used to craft, create, deconstruct a whole lot of other things, and this country, when they're constantly talking about the ideals, we know it wasn't founded on values that centered humanity, and you'd be hard pressed to see a sustained effort to uplift, center, support humanity without just constantly being under attack. This country was founded with not only racist ideals, but wealthy, well-funded racist ideals. We're Ish and I, yes, we're very Philly, based in Philly, and this is where a lot of these conversations were happening about how do we exclude, not include, how do we exclude the most amount of people? And their exclusion included the people who came from their countries too, so how do we exclude certain amount, and how do we do a land grab, a financial wealth grab, to the detriment and dehumanization of others, right? Like, a lot of those conversations happened right here in Philadelphia. People were traveling for weeks to get here to put their stake in the ground of, this is how we're going to do this land grab. So if it started from that, and the genesis of this country was that, and now it has continued, even with progress, you see that there's a rabid racist response to any semblance of progress, racial progress in particular, any semblance of that, you'll see the rabid nature of racism come out from the woodwork. It's almost like, I don't know if y'all have seen these, like there's some bugs and insects that love decaying matter, and if you mess with it, I'm outside a lot. So those who can't follow me, I get it. But if you're outside and you lift up a rock, or you bother any kind of decaying matter, you're gonna see all kind of stuff start crawling out. That's what like coming out the woodwork. That's what it is. It's like you start seeing all these bugs and insects and all of these things, and that's what I feel happens anytime there's some racial progress. They come out the woodwork. They come out of the rotten wood and really start trying to step backwards, and not a little bit, not pause it, like literally, okay, how do we reverse it in a particular and peculiar way, particularly for a country that's constantly wanting to export democracy and export human rights and export racial justice, but packaged in their own white exceptional way. So, Ish, what do you think? I mean, particularly as you're developing curriculum, history teacher for a decade, civic leader, how are you thinking about this in particular? Like, what ramifications should we be not only bracing and planning for, but countering?
Well, first, I definitely want to uplift what you just were uplifting right there, right? This danger of this myth of racial progress, right? And that even goes into what hip
We
hop.
like fairy tales, bro. We like fairy tales and stories. We want Cinderella. We want the Seven Dwarfs. We want, we love a good fairy tale. The European version of fairy tale, not no Nancy Spider Rabbit fairy tale, because then justice is due in those, right? Like there's, you can be the bad guy and win, right? Goldilocks straight hijack like they're joy, and she won, right? Like so they always got the. It's interesting. The bad guys win in their fairy tales all the time.
Yeah, man. It's Tyler Qualley has a line. He's like, waiting on Superman, and all we get is Lex Luthor. But like speaking on to like
right.
The deeper issue, with all the attacks on CRT, it's real interesting. If you actually read the person who is credited of like starting that first intellectual work around what would be called CRT, it's Derek Bell. And you actually read Derek Bell, he's basically was saying this is what happens within this society, that we have these temporary peaks of progress where we can point to and be like, look how much we've moved forward, look how much advance has been made, right? Then it goes back into the same patterns, and it's rolled back into the same patterns of white dominance. And it realigns based on the time period of what it looks like, but it still goes back into those same patterns. And I think one of those things, we have to be honest, number one, about that. And I think that's one of the things that we're focusing on the curriculum, less of like what we wish it is, what we, hope it would be, or, what others, but really looking hardcore at our history in an honest way. So, the 4th of July is coming up next week, right? So like the part of the curriculum now, students have to explore like what role did really the institution of slavery and the competing of those interests play with the colonists actually being influenced to actually rebel against England. And then look at some of the facts that Gerald Horne in his great book, Countering the Revolution 1776, lays out about several incidents that actually point to a large role of slave insurrection in the British colonies in the Caribbean were playing that pushed colonists away from Great Britain, Great Britain's acquiescence to some, freedom around some enslaved people who are suing for it. So like all these type of things, greatly influenced it, but that's part of the story that's usually left out. But you include that story, you look at it different, right? So when we're talking about like things back to like affirmative action and the mythologies that we tell ourselves about this society, right? How we're
Oh, Ish, I don't know if you froze or I froze.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, you're back. Yeah,
All
yeah,
right. Dang, hopefully I wasn't about to say something I wasn't supposed to say.
yeah.
No, but like we've made enough racial progress to this point that it's like, oh, just get over it. We need racial neutral policies because there's already been, the Civil Rights Act. You people had welfare. These type of ideas are kind of what I would even call common sense racism amongst whites, right? It feeds into this indoctrinated mythology about this society being fair. And so if you just believe the society is being fair and that certain things have been made advanced enough where you feel that it's unfair towards you because your worldview of the world, it's a all or nothing game where if others get some, that means you lose out. If you look at the world like that, and then you put on top of it a racialized kind of identity-based type of politic, you're going to get this type of situation. Politicians benefit from throwing minority populations under a bus or people of color under the bus, right? Because we all know people of color are actually the majority in the world. But politicians in countries in Europe right now are even benefiting from throwing the scary immigrant under the bus. Joe Biden has an immigration, you know what I mean? So like when we look at this stuff,
we're going to take all your resources, all your wealth, we're going to colonize you, and then we're going to leave with the booty, but you all stay put, right? No, they should follow their minerals, their resources, their rubber, their gold, their diamond, their ore, their the cobalt. Like, no, they should be following. And first of all, you shouldn't be allowed to leave. I wish all of those places could be nationalized, but we know that war comes when you try to nationalize, and they will try to devastate your country for generations, right? And so we know all the deep politics. We know the involvement of the U.S. government, European governments, how they collaborate to carve up Africa, to carve up Asia, and how those policies continue today. And in this very land, very similar policies, different name, but very similar, definitely same mindset and orientation.
And see right there, like the fact you just started talking about that in that way actually shows like these topics are not just limited, right, to questions about affirmative action, right? We're talking about a larger type of project that is going on where, again, we might have those temporary peaks of progress that we can point to and be like, look how much like progress we made, right? But just like a poor Black kid in a project building in Chicago in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed, what did that mean to him? Right? Supposedly you always had equal rights and protection underneath the 14th Amendment, right? These are just the realities that we don't present to our youth in a way that really has them questioning and actually understanding that these type of things, these types of rights, these types of ideas of freedom are not permanent and also have been cultivated over generations. And it wasn't articulated by George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, right? They were talking about their ability and their freedom to exploit, to be a king themselves in their own sovereign right. But when we talk about the freedom that Harriet Tubman was talking about, we're talking about the freedom that, Martin Luther King and all the other people they parade around us and try to fit into this story of racial progress. They were talking about fighting for something, an ideal that still
Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, all of them, yeah.
Yeah, man. So, that is what needs to be front and center in our curriculums when we're talking about those are the things that like folks like Mom for Bigotry right now in Philadelphia are afraid of. You know what I mean? Like those ideas, because really you're really presenting the world in reality and asking students to really analyze it and be critical about it. Once you do that, that blows up the mythology that they were told at nighttime before they went to bed, right? That blows up the mythology that we have to protect our children from when they're watching television nowadays, right? If you're aware of those type of things. But like these are the conversations that need to be happening across all groups of people. We need to be honest about it, right? I speak loudly so my enemy can hear me type mentality. Because at the end of the day, we're not guaranteed these things. The 14th Amendment was passed. Doesn't mean that means it can be repealed. You know what I mean? They also went around that, John, anyway, for almost 100 years. and still are in some cases. So like these are just the realities of Black people in America. But these lessons, these stories also transfer to the experience of non-white immigrants coming into this society now, right? It doesn't matter if you think you're colorblind or whatever, like this is America. You know what I mean? Folks are going to ask, you're going to be associated, and you can choose, like benefiting wise, right? Which shows that a lot of Latinos, we're actually seeing this in real time right now, are identifying as racially white. And it's the same phenomenon with Italians and Irish people. They weren't white when they first got here. They became white. And part of becoming white is to accept the mythology. Part of the mythology is to accept the mythology around.
They like join this political party, this white political party, right? You want you want the American real red carpet, you have to join us. And first of all, you got to earn. And number one way to earn it is show your anti-Blackness. Yeah. Right. That's when you start making progress in this country and you start being let into the, into the club, into the union league.
Yeah. And what you just said just went full circle about what we're talking about overall. Right. When we're talking about who makes decisions about what is put in front of our children, right? When it comes to what type of ideas and concepts are reinforced within school buildings about what should be looked for, right? So affirmative action, yeah, that's all good, but like affirmative action, Clarence Thomas, we got him to the point where he obviously benefited from policies like that, right? In Yale and the Supreme Court, even like this, the thinking like that. But he was also elevated to the Supreme Court because he was, look, this Black person's saying this. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And see, that has always been, Carter G. Woodson talked about this. This has always been a tactic within this society to do that. Yeah. It's okay if a Black person says some racist, stuff. All you got to do is watch Fox News and the folks they parade around that, John. But like that feeds into, again, what I was referring to earlier, that kind of common sense racism that folks are indoctrinated with in this society around anti-Black ideas. Even Black people are indoctrinated about them ideas about themselves. And that's why
that's the best way to do it, man. That's the best way to amplify anti-Blackness is to have a Black person do it. You know what I mean? Like what better weapon to parade in front of folks and be like, see, look, one of your own kind. Like, not really, no. Like, you know what I mean? We know all skin folk ain't kinfolk and all kinfolk ain't kindred is what the old heads used to say, right? So like, nah, that ain't, it's a reason that, they'll open the gate just a little bit to make sure that there's someone, and then they'll be on the other side of that gate. But the thing about it, they'll be in an enclosed gate. They think, you ever see those indoor porches they have in Philly? Yep. Where it's gated, not the indoor porch. It's still an outdoor porch, but it's like a gated porch, right? Like they have those in Philly. So folks, if you imagine having a porch and there's a gate around it, like you can see through it, but you have to actually unlock it to get in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're bars on around the porch. So that's what a lot of these jokers are. And they think they got into the house and at the table, but they're really not. Mm-hmm. They're just inside that, but you're still a brother in a cage, mentally, spiritually, intellectually, you're still outside of them and confined with air, but you are keeping everyone else out, right? Like trying to keep the masses house, as Malcolm would say, like, no, we all right, we sick. That's what I feel like, people like Clarence Doug, they were like, no, we sick. The system. This system is messed up. We got to fix this, boss. We got to fix this. They messing up our system. Like, yeah, all right.
Yeah, man. The Frontline PBS had the great documentary about Clarence Thomas recently, which actually showed that.
I didn't see that.
Yeah, it's really heavy.
Put that link in there too.
Yeah, I gotta find that, John. But
all right, no worries. We'll find it.
Yeah. But like in it shows like after King's assassination, he actually was very radicalized. Mm-hmm. Like even like so much so like talking against interracial marriage. Mm-hmm. So, like it's really interesting to flip. And they talk about, I don't want to give too much around the doc, but they show the flip and they talk to people that knew them in college, their friends and all that. It's heavy, man. But like when we're talking about that in this society, that there's a lot of mirages and camouflages that are associated with it, right? And then it's also marketed now, right? Our associative identities, what we associate with and who we befriend and what we look for and look at and everything. And then those ideas and products are now marketed back to us. You know what I mean? That's also another level that folks don't understand, that our prejudices and our biases are played to somewhat at times. And then we also got to think, what would be the purpose of that? What would be the purpose of like inflaming all these type of tensions? And unfortunately, within the society, you can do that when it comes to racism. At the end of the day, it's always there at the bottom of, right there under the surface, because it's embedded within the very structure. It's part of the rationalization about how the system works. And it's part of the psychological wages of whiteness that folks still benefit from psychologically. You know what I mean? And we have to be extremely honest. But talking like this is viewed as dangerous. It's viewed as radical, per se. And it's like when people always say that, oh, well, I agree with some stuff y'all talking about, whatever, and I'll be like, well, it's all good, bro. You still got time to learn. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I don't go up to other people and be like, I agree with some of the things you're talking about, but and I don't know if that tolerable deviancy ever happened to you, Sharif. But that's real by some folks.
Yeah. And I think there's also, like we, as educators, we play such a critical role. And that's why we need like educators who are really keenly aware of being able to, show the system the pitfalls, critique it, really have students critique it, like age appropriate, in-depth, rigorous intellectual analysis of here's what it is. And you don't have to even give your opinion. You can just like, here's what it is. Here's what the Constitution says. Who are they talking about? Who are the times? Look at the historical. Okay, what about today? How do we, overlay what's happening today and have students be able to understand, okay, what is justice? What is fairness? What are ideals? What are values? What are amendments and how are they being, applied? Who applied them? What, and just start looking, what is a democracy? And is this really a democracy when you say, and have students look at, okay, here's the definition of a democracy. What are examples that it would come to pass in a functioning democracy, a healthy democracy? But then also looking at, okay, well, let's look at the Senate. Let's look at examples and see like, okay, your definition of democracy, does it apply to the Senate? Does it apply to the racial makeup of, the country? Does it apply to, school funding? Okay, does this demonstrate a healthy democracy, right? Like, and so what we want students to do is be able to be critical analyzers of the life, the conditions, the systems, the world, right? Like that's what it is, being able to be a critical thinker. And everybody in somewhere in their mission statement, vision statement for their district, whether SEA, what is it? SEA and LEA, whatever, whether state, local, city, town, you want your students to be critical thinkers. Okay, then are you giving them the practice to analyze things and apply things and see how does it all apply? What's up, bro? And and being able to do that. Okay, so let's apply this here. And when I was in the classroom, man, what we would love to, no matter what we were reading or discussing, was talking about whose voice, perspective, and experiences are being centered and whose is missing or whose is marginalized, right? The missing, the marginalized versus centered and championed, right? And just kind of, so no matter what, they can't fall for the okie doke, no matter what. They were like, wait a minute, all right, well, this is interesting, but let me look at this again and see whose voice is missing. Whose voice would I be interested in hearing? Whose perspective would I be curious about learning more, right? And part of it at that time, I wasn't, I was in early 20s. I wasn't thinking about like having, how that could help with empathy. I was more or less just thinking about like, need you to analyze critically, be a critical thinker, and not fall for okie doke stuff and propaganda within, right? Because everybody talks about propaganda is always some third world country and some dictator. Like, no, you live it right here, you know. So so all of that, I think, just as teachers, as educators, but also just as leaders, like, you don't have to be this formal teacher role, to do that. It's actually even more important that people in the community are aware. And again, it's not just the system, the system, the system. It's like, here's the system. All right, what are we doing to, empower and first educate and empower and organize, right? Like, taking on that rallying cry can't just be point out, like, what's wrong. It also has to be to uplift, to build, to inspire, and help connect the dots of navigation.
Yeah, no, and the story of our oppression has also been a story of our resistance,
Resistance, joy, creativity,
our
beauty.
humanization, yeah, of this world, right? And so when you do tell those stories and you learn really, really from what folks did, right? And in situations where their life was devalued to the point where it was just property, right? And how people even found value within themselves and articulated value and you know what I mean? And that humanity that developed, like that's something that's transferable, like you said, like it's empathy, but I would even say it's deeper than empathy, right? It's that feeling of respect towards others and towards humanity in a deeper type of way, right? And that's also when you tell the story for real, right? Yeah, 4th of July and all that, right? But like enslavement was still maintained afterwards. You know what I mean? Like, you can't talk about freedom and independence for Black folks at that time, right? And then that comes to fundamental questions about how we even tell ourselves stories about this society, right? Like you were just saying. But then those resistance stories, how people used that narrative, how people used the idea of all men are created equal, written by an enslaver, right? Who was having children later on with his dead wife's half sister, who was his slave, right? Having children with the woman, owning those people, right? And those stories, like, of resistance and how people still maintain, people use those words against them in order to gain more freedom for all people. There's no coincidence that Martin Luther King used that language and that rhetoric, right? There's no coincidence that Benjamin Banneker and Richard Allen and all these folks throughout history used those words, knowing very, very well that those words weren't necessarily meant for them. But they're like, yeah, but you're saying this, that it is meant because we are human beings as much as an equal stage as you. And that's the position, even regardless of how they try to change up the rules and switch up, you know what I mean, the guardrails on people.
Yeah.
So like that long narrative and fight, I think, speaks to kind of that tradition that we're part of. And it's actually really short, right? Like, Sharif, like you're a product of that, the last like pinnacle, I would argue, a Black struggle in this country, right? The late 60s, early 70s. Like, you're a product of that generation. And then you're that generation and then next, right? Like, that's a short amount of time when we're even talking about this idea of a semblance of freedom or equal status underneath the law within this society, at least on the books, and at least the general majority of the public seemingly gets outraged if abused, right? But like, these are the these are the facts. Like, we're only talking about a short amount of time then there, how much ideas, how much of those traditions and legacies have been lost in a short amount of time. And we have to reclaim that. We have to re-identify. We have to adapt to really the real kind of realignment of how white supremacy is realigning itself right now. It's purposely a little bit more gray and multicolored, you know what I mean?
It's the Empire Strikes Back. When I saw that joint yesterday, I'm like, this is a classic Empire Strikes Back joint. Like, they've been building. It didn't just happen out of nowhere, right? Like, it's been building. You can't do a Death Star in just with one ruling. The Death Star is built with 1,000 rulings. 1,000 rulings across state, local, city, federal, supreme, right? Like that's how the Death Star is created, right? And so, when I think about, all of what you said and, and the work of the 60s and 70s and being a product, what I think about is like, how we would even just taught to analyze things. So yes, we would look at, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, all their, so-called, stances. But then we'd also compare it to what's David Walker saying? What's Frederick Douglass saying? What's Sojourner saying? Right. And so we're like looking and being able to compare which one is talking about everyone and which one is talking about a very specific group. Which one can actually be used to push this country forward into a better space, even though it started in such a rotten space in this, in this way that it was, created and conditioned, right? Like how could this be really evolved into something different? Would it be really someone who sells their children, right? Like, because at the end of the day, like these people were selling their own children. They can say whatever they want about, their belief in God, their ideals, their values. You were making babies and then selling them. You're making babies for profit, right? Like, I mean, it's such a crazy concept of like this. These were the shapers and arbiters of what this country, looks like and things like that. And then you had other groups who like, oh, that's too far. We're not going to do that. But they still had a whole lot of anti-Blackness, anti-Native American, anti-Indigenous, anti-Chinese, right? Like they still had a whole lot of, yeah, we won't sell our babies. Some were like, you shouldn't even be making, like all that miscegenation and all that kind of stuff. But there was other group, like there's a whole continuum of folks. The amount of people that were actually pro-humanity was tiny. So I think those are two things that we could also look at, like on a continuum of anti-racist and rabid racism, where were some of these folks on that continuum based off of what they did? This is the stuff that in schools would be illegal, today, right? And some of it's not even necessarily illegal. It's just that they want to scare people not talking about it. Because when you look at some of these rules, they're so vague. It's not saying that you can't, right? Like it's just saying like, oh, you're going to be reported or marginalized or pushed or harassed, right? Like even in Virginia, there's not a actual law about it, but they can say, hey, here's a hotline. Just call if you're made to feel, if your child is made to feel uncomfortable about history. No matter like what we're doing today, let's hide history and let's hide it by replicating what they did historically, and let's do that contemporarily, but don't talk about it, right? Like I'm just like, y'all actually are the best teachers, of your grandparents' historic racism, because you're implementing it now. Like this is what was in your trust. This was in your will, the will that they left you, and how you're approaching this today, right? Yeah, hide your grandparents' actions by replicating and reinforcing those actions today. Because my kids are going to be reading about this history about how you were trying to hide it, but by being racist, like it's crazy when you really look at it. But I think that timeline, that continuum of anti-racist to race, like where all these so-called lionized heroes fit into, where do the policies fit? Is this pro-humanity and anti-racist? Somewhat so, or the exact opposite. But you also that timeline that you talked about, right? Like, okay, when did folks, hijack this country? Where are we today? Where did the civil rights, and actually look at that timeline, like, okay, how many years is actually, let's just say, oh, the civil rights is the line of demarcation, for some folks. Okay, fine. You want to start there? Let's look at that. Okay, now look at the continuum. All right. And then what's happened since then? And then tell me like, oh yeah, this is all should be now race neutral. And then I said the third piece, I would love to hear your point about your perspective on this too. What does it mean for recent immigrants, some who are more educated than others, some who come from countries where they were, all Black, and aren't quite, the amount of people, when I visited Africa a couple of times, the amount of people, and I'm not just talking about like laymen, I'm talking about politicians, leader, like, you know what I mean, like people who are in positions of authority, influence, education, and they say they had really no idea about the Black experience in America. And I was shocked when, because I just grew up thinking, Pan-Africanism and the diaspora, that everybody was aware of, like how we're aware about the colonization and the Berlin Conference and all, like we're aware of these things. I was shocked, like they weren't aware about the Haitian Revolution, the plight of Black America. They were like, no, that's not taught in our schools. And you'll have like a small group who are just like, again, political education, but they're like, it's usually outside the schools. They're like, we still have the kind of in a lot of spaces, the colonial construct of formal education. And so I was absolutely shocked. And I've been to Senegal, Congo, Rwanda. I think that's it. You know what I mean? But like each time, people are just like, no, there's not, and I'm with people who are aware, but they're just talking about in general, it's not a thing, right? And so then imagine you're not aware, but then you're coming here and they hand you a pamphlet like, yo, Black America, kind of anti-Black and anti-Black American particularly, and handed that pamphlet like, hey, this is part of the naturalization process for you to become, informally, right? Like just ways. But those are the kind of three kind of ideas and stuff that I've been like wrestling with for a bit. The timeline, the continuum of anti-race, pro-humanity versus the opposite, and then just the, as people come on, come here, and we even see the sense. I mean, I've talked to Iranians, and they're like, yeah, we have to choose white on the census. There's no place, right? And so it's like they're like, we don't consider ourselves what. Some of them do, don't get me wrong, but there's some, the ones I associate with, they're like, we don't really consider ourselves. Arabs too, like we don't consider ourselves white, but that's the only place to put ourselves on this census, right? And so, which is that also masks what numbers actually might be, what right. So all, man, it's so much going on, Ish. I don't. And sorry for the folks who are listening. We're like, yo, these jokers all over the place. Chris ain't here to kind of help steer the ship, so we just like wilding out. When Chris is away, the brothers go play. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, no, that's real, and that timeline stuff is real, man. And when we're even talking about how we understand history, and I think Amos Wilson in his writing does a great job, especially in the book The Falsification of African Consciousness. I suggest anybody who's interested in how we view history and how we view history influences how we view the world, I strongly suggest that book. But like how things are presented to us, how stories are told to us, right? What does the significance that we place in the values that we place on certain things, right? And then that timeline and how that story is told, right? And again, I was saying, I always say this, right? Although these attacks, right, they have laws in 18 states that say that you can't teach or talk about these things, right? Like you said, the purpose for the most part is to really scare people from teaching about that, right? We also need to keep in mind that most people weren't really teaching that much of a hardcore aspect of that at all anyway to begin with, right? So like, even when storylines about like the story of Black people are reduced to like enslavement, Lincoln freeing the slaves, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and Barack Obama, we're already packaging it in a way where the story is fitting into how the mythology of the society is telling itself about itself, right?
Right. I mean, just let me interrupt you for a second. Yeah. That whole Lincoln thing, everybody was on this whole rage of removing statues. And I'm down. Like, if it's racist name of, like, you know what I mean, going to a high school named after the KKK wizard, to me, like, yeah, that's whack. But I'd rather, and this is, this might be an unpopular, opinion, but I'd rather that join, I think it's in Boston somewhere or New England, where that Black man kissing Lincoln's feet statue, I'd rather that be removed before Rizzo was removed. Like I'd rather that be. I'm rather like, yeah, prioritize that statue of getting rid of that joint before any of the grand wizards like Frank Rizzo and others, right? Because I'm like that narrative, that message, that all of that. But anyway, when you talk about Lincoln and the friend, it's like it just that image just keeps popping up in my head all the time, and I hate it.
Listen, man, we just got done Juneteenth, bro. So don't even get me started about how some of these narratives at our own events, folks are basically saying, and once we learned that, they were free, and it's like, nah, man, slave masters literally took their enslaved people and brought them to Texas during the war because that was the furthest output of the war, and that the Union Army didn't get there to enforce the policy. It had nothing to do with folks not being aware. And it speaks to, even within this own society, when they claim that these things are happening, it still has to be militarily enforced. And we all know what happens once the Union military is pulled out at the end of when Reconstruction was ended, and then the almost 100 years of domestic terrorism that followed, and racialized apartheid within the system, right?
And they knew. And here's the thing: all y'all heroes who love and got all these, they knew what would happen when they pulled out, right? Like that's the thing. It's like, oh yeah, there's gonna be hell to pay, and we don't care. As long as we can continue this land grab, as long as y'all not taking the wealth out of this country by making it into two countries, right? Like all of that, like, yeah, we're gonna use this as a political and a wartime decision to free Black folk, not from this benevolence, because hey, if y'all still down with us, you can hold on to them as for as long as possible, right? Delaware, other place that didn't leave the Union, so to speak. Like, no, you can still hold them in bondage. No, that's not a problem. We're doing this as a political and a wartime decision, not from this, oh, let's be more humane and let's be more Christian, let's be more whatever. None of that was factored in. It was like, yo, how do we win this? We taking the L. And both sides, all right, now we'll let Black folks fight and kill white people. And let's, sign this emancipation for those that tried to divide the country. Right? Like it was two parts, multiple parts. But like those are the two of the things I'm like, why does this part keep getting missed? We're in Philly, and y'all forget like Delaware like people weren't safe. Black people weren't safe in Delaware, even after that joint was signed, right? Like it's like, oh my gosh.
Because Delaware was a border slave state, which was part of the Union, and therefore not under the requirements of your enslaved population being free, because you weren't at war with the Union.
Right? As long as you're still with us, you know what I mean?
But like that, and like you said, like, and many people don't even know this, and I didn't learn this until I started writing curriculum and really getting into the weeds. But December 1862, a month before the Emancipation Proclamation was finally finalized, right? Lincoln tried to put through a colonization bill to colonize Africans, like free them, but then colonize them into different places, and even put money through Congress. Got bills passed around it earlier in the year. Even called in some Black leaders to say, you're in the way of this country. Like nobody really wants you here. It's not good for you to be here. Trying to convince people to be colonized outside. So like this idea of this benevolent white savior stuff, man, and it's still promulgated. Like anytime I walk into somebody's house, right, and I see a picture of, and hopefully I don't get in trouble for saying anything like this, but like, a picture of white Jesus next to JFK, Barack Obama, and Abraham, you know what I mean? Like,
man, listen, our old school, I had relatives that you went in and you would see those images, JFK, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King, you know what I mean? And Jesus, depending on the nomination, but a blonde hair version. And I've been to the Middle East, I grew up in the Middle East, and I never quite saw a whole lot of, blonde haired folks, you know what I mean? But, that's, but yeah, I mean, listen, I remember in school, so many times when Lincoln would be talked about, his quotes would be a part of it, right? Like part of the story, where it's like one thing, to understand, like, hey, like, look, we benefited from the emancipation. You know what I mean? We benefited from finally letting, Black soldiers, many of them who were trained in Philadelphia. We were right outside of Philadelphia, right? Camp William Penn.
Yeah.
Like that Frederick Douglass was helping organize and recruit his own son, right? And so like that's hallowed ground as far as we're concerned. We would actually go camping out in that space where they were like, hey, this is where Black Union soldiers were trained to go, and some of them were many of them were from up north, right? But they were still saying like, yes, we have brothers, and we're going to join this. But like, being able to analyze Lincoln's words and say, look, if I could keep this country together and keep enslavement, I would. Right? You know what I mean? So like, even as an 8-year-old, you got to understand, like, wait a minute, let me get this right. You would, if the country, if that would keep the country together, you would still support, protect this institution of enslavement? Like, oh, okay, all right.
Oh yeah, no, don't get twisted. Lincoln offered Confederate states, if they rejoined the Union, they would be able to maintain slavery for another 40 years before the emancipation. Like Lincoln went out of his way and hustled backwards. While running for president, he supported the original 13th Amendment, also known as the Crowin Amendment, Crowin, for folks who want to Google this. But that the original 13th Amendment would have maintained slavery legal and permanent where it currently existed. And Lincoln was supporting that bill, and it had almost enough states in support, because you need a certain amount of states for an amendment to become part of the Constitution. And then the South started the Civil War. The Confederacy broke away. So like that almost went down, and Lincoln was in support of it. So like, again, this goes back full circle again of like the stories that we tell ourselves, the narratives, the mythology that the society says, and how then it shapes the way we view our current circumstances and situation, right? And I always say this to the teachers who I deliver professional development to. I used to challenge my students. I always used to say to them, go ask your favorite teacher this, right? But I always like, well, were Black people ever meant to be free in this society? Right? Just that simple question. And if they study, like, the only reason, right, Black people have any semblance of freedom right now is because people fought for it. It wasn't given. It's not even like maintained properly over a long period of time. So like when people start wavering,
I wish if I could do the hands of time, man, I would make sure that we could have taught in the same building or the same school without, because I was a history literature teacher too. And very similarly, I used to tell them, when they were like, I'm like, are Black people citizens? I'm like, that's the question you should always ask. And they were like, yeah, we got this, we got that. I was like, Malcolm used to say, if they got to keep passing laws to say that you're a citizen, that means you're not really a citizen. You know what I mean? So they got to keep passing like, hey, we're going to do this. Hey, we're going to add this. Hey, we're going to put like, that means you're not really, you know what I mean? They try to like make it, do some hocus pocus and make you think you are. You really ain't. They ain't got to pass no laws for white people to know, like, this my joint. Like, this is my world, this is my country, I'm a
I'm American.
throated citizen, American, right? They ain't got no, but like they'll pass stuff to make them more powerful, give them more power, give them more land grab, give them more of all that. But it ain't about citizenship and human rights. So,
oh no, just the language and the iconography around it, but not actually the reality. I mean, that's always been the case here, though, right? Mm-hmm. If anything, some of the rights that were achieved during civil rights, right, for people getting killed and their houses bombed and over a protracted struggle, right, over a decade, 2 decades almost, and then even those rights are getting turned back right now as we speak, right?
Yeah,
like that. We don't talk about the fact that the world was watching America's image was not matching up to the reality that people were showing the rest of the world, and that's why arguably a lot of those things were achievable. And sometimes you have to put that mirror up for folks to see, this ain't all good, man. But at the same time, these are the examples that we can point to of folks who actually did the good fight, not just individuals, but also collective organizations, and try to learn from the mistakes, learn from the gains that they make, and reapply it to our current circumstances. And that's why I salute the Center of Black Educator Development. I salute any organization that is actually putting that thought and that work behind really cultivating real thinking behind what they're trying to produce, not just trying to produce a dollar bill, if you know what I mean. So
no, absolutely, man. Look, yo, we didn't get to July 4th, but everything that we talked about is why we ain't down, we won't bang with that joint in the construct that is described. But we always get to celebrate times when people have a common day off, because that's where we can plot and plan for our people. Listen, we miss you, Chris Stewart, and Citizen Stewart. And, as he would remind, all of us, that you've been listening to another Freedom Friday episode, and you're still not free, but hopefully you're a little freer than you were an hour ago. Thanks a lot. Have a great, safe weekend. Keep up the resistance. And if you haven't joined the resistance yet, it ain't too late. Peace.